the earliest origins of the codes of conduct governing armed conflicts are distant and impossible to trace, what has come to be known as international humanitarian law has ancient historical precursors. These include Hammurabi's Code, the Mahabharata, the Bible, the Quran, the Japanese Code of Bushido, and many others. A more recent and direct influence on modern conceptions of international humanitarian law came from the father of the international law, Dutch philosopher and legal scholar Hugo Grotius. The modern development of ISL is most often traced to the writings of Henry Dunant and Francis Leiber in the mid-19th century. The Memory of Solferino. Dunant detailed his experience with war after witnessing one of the bloodiest battles of the 19th century, the Battle of Solferino between France and its Italian allies and Austria in northern Italy in 1859. He was horrified by the lack of assistance for the wounded and defenseless persons after the battle. This experience prompted Dunant and several others to find out the charitable humanitarian association, the Geneva Association of Public Welfare, in 1863 that later became the International Committee of the Red Cross, in brief ICRC. Further, Dunant and others lobbied the Swiss and other European governments to convene an international conference to establish rules and institutions for the care of those wounded in combat. As a result of these efforts, 12 European states adopted the first modern ISL treaty in 1864, the Geneva Convention for the Amelioration of the Conditions of the Wounded in Armies in the Field. In 1862, across the Atlantic Ocean, US President Abraham Lincoln asked Columbia University professor Francis Leiber to write up rules of conduct in war for use by the Union Army during the American Civil War. Leiber produced instructions for the government armies of the United States in the field, known as the Leiber Instructions or the Leiber Code. Though the Leiber Code was not a treaty and only formally bound one side of the American Civil War, it represented a codification of the current usages and customs of World I, North America and Europe in the middle of the 19th century. The major conflicts of the past 2 centuries have done a great deal to mold contemporary ISL. A number of treaties and declarations preceded the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the additional protocols of 1977. These were largely refined and reformulated into the principles contained in the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols. They include the body of conventions and declarations known as the Laws of the Hague. The Hague Peace Conference of 1899 and 1907 were convened at the request of Russia for the purpose of discussion on the subjects of lasting peace and disarmament. The conference failed in their objective to achieving lasting peace but did succeed in the development of a number of principles placing limits on the means and methods of warfare. These principles were codified in the numerous conventions and declarations, including the following. The Hague Convention I of 1899 for the Pacific Settlement of International Disputes. The Hague I established the Permanent Court of Arbitration (PCA), also known as the Hague Tribunal, precursor to later international tribunals. The PCA remains operative in dispute resolution between states, private parties, and intergovernmental organizations, and sits at the juncture between public and private international law. The Hague Convention II of 1899 Convention with respect to the laws and customs of war on land. The Hague too expanded on the labor code and introduced principles governing the treatment of prisoners of war, the law of occupation, and prohibited certain specified battle tactics such as the use of poisoned weapons, treacherous killing or wounding, and employing arms, projectiles, or material or in nature of cause superfluous injury. Other Hague Conventions such as the Hague 4 and the Hague 13 expanded the Hague 2's prohibitions on the methods and means of conducting hostilities. Geneva Conventions. The core principles of international humanitarian law are now expressed in the 1949 Geneva Conventions and the 1977 additional protocols. Collectively, these documents comprise the fundamental rules of ISL and are supplemented in specific situations by additional treaty law, such as the conventions prohibiting the use of specific weapons as well as principles of customary international humanitarian law. As mentioned earlier, in 1864, the Swiss government, prompted by the 5 founding members of ICRC, convened the Diplomatic Conference of 1864, which led to the adoption of the original Geneva Conventions. Due to the mass atrocities of World War II, a further diplomatic conference was convened and held in Geneva from April 22 to 12 August 1949. This 20th century conference revised and expanded the existing principles of international humanitarian law, including the 1864 Geneva Convention, and recognizes them into the 1949 Geneva Conventions. However, in the context dealing with any situation of armed conflict or war on land as envisaged by the earlier conventions, the first Geneva Convention is more relevant. Convention for the Amelioration of the Condition of the Wounded and Sick in Armed Forces in the Field, Geneva 1. Geneva 1 establishes as the categories of combat and non-combatants and assigns particular rights and duties to those classes in the context of armed conflict. It also addresses treatment of the wounded, the protection of the medical personnel, the role of the ICRC and to combatants and non-combatants, and makes explicit the obligation of the parties to the conflict. The text of the first convention, as revised by the 1949 conference, follows traditional lines and the fundamental principles that govern former versions. Wounded and sick and defenseless combatant shall be respected and cared for, whatever be their nationality, personnel attending them, the building in which they take shelter, in the equipments used for their benefits shall be protected. A red cross on a white ground shall be the emblem of this immunity, as well as be seen later. The greatest divergence arises from the very conditions of modern warfare, which made it necessary to restrict the privileges of medical personnel and equipment in enemy hands. On the other hand, almost all articles have been made more precise. The Geneva provisions are followed by Chapter 2 dealing with the wounded and sick. Article 13, drawn from 1929 Prisoners of War Convention, enumerates the categories of persons put on the same footing as members of the armed forces and hence entitled to protection under the convention. Whereas the 1929 text demanded respect and protection only for the wounded, Article 12, which is new, gives a list of prohibited acts such as attempts upon life, torture, and willful abandonment, and so on. The information to be given about wounded captives and their duties to the dead have been defined by Articles 16 and 17. A new provision in Article 18 guarantees to the inhabitants and to relief societies the right of assisting the wounded and sick. Chapter 3, dealing with medical units and establishment, hasn't undergone alteration except for the introduction of Article 23, that is, creation of safety zones and localities. Chapter 4, dealing with medical personnel and chaplains, has been greatly modified. Hitherto, such personnel falling into enemy hands had to be immediately repatriated. The 1949 Convention provides that they may, in certain circumstances, be retained to care for prisoners of war. Their special status and the conditions for the repatriation of those not required, as mentioned in Articles 30 to 32, have been carefully defined in Article 28, thus filling a serious gap. Chapter 5, dealing with medical equipment, has been substantially altered to take changes regarding personnel into account. Equipment need no longer be handed back to the belligerent to whom it belongs. Chapter 6, similar provision is made for transport vehicles dealt by Article 35. It should be noted that medical aircrafts are now authorized in certain circumstances to fly over neutral countries dealt by Article 37. Chapter 7, relating to distinctive emblem, marks no change in principle. Nevertheless, Article 44, the wording of which left so much to be desired in the 1929 text, is now stated in logical and balanced terms. While the protective emblem is subject to strict safeguards, the purely indicatory emblem may be widely used by Red Cross societies. Chapter 8, dealing with the application of the Convention, calls for no comment. Reference has already been made to Chapter 19, dealing with repression of abuses and infraction, and the final provisions. Article 53, which is peculiar to the first convention, is intended to prevent abuse of the distinctive emblem. The additional protocols. The two 1977 additional protocols to the 1949 Geneva Conventions were adopted by consensus at the 1974 Diplomatic Conference on the Reaffirmation and Development of International Humanitarian Law applicable in armed conflicts. They emerge out of concerns that modern developments in weaponry, including weapons capable of inflicting massive casualties and extensive and long-term damage to state infrastructure and the natural environment, call for the adoption of new rules of conduct applicable to armed conflict. The additional protocols are also known as the optional protocols. The protocols have not been as extensively ratified as the Geneva Conventions, and unlike many of the principles of the conventions, legal scholars do not consider them to constitute norms of customary international law. In conclusion, we can see that adoption of the first and the old Geneva Convention was the stepping stone in the humanitarian law. This convention was the first which specifically provides for the protection of the wounded and sick in the armed forces in the field, and they are protected under the international human rights codes. Despite its basic mandates, it was successful in effecting significant and rapid reforms.